Hi there, and welcome to Projex Academy's Scrum Masterclass, Scrum 2021 Update. Let me just explain what you're looking at. You will have already studied our Scrum Masterclass, created a couple of years ago, and you may be wondering whether the new exams of 2021 onwards have been sufficiently covered in our training. Well, the answer is yes, it has. However, what happened was back in November of 2020, the two grandfathers of Scrum, if you will, Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, created simply an updated Scrum guide, which in a nutshell includes some tightening up and refocusing of some of the elements of Scrum. However, you'll be pleased to know that Scrum in essence has not changed at all. Nonetheless, I thought it would be helpful and useful to produce 4 short video modules just highlighting some of the key areas that have been tightened up. And by tightening up, what Jeff and Ken were referring to is that over the past decade, since the first Scrum Guide was back in 2010, there's been a lot of knowledge and practical experience garnered, and this has enabled some lessons to be learned from things that went well and things that were not done quite so well. And it's the latter that I'm particularly interested in here, as that is the main focus of the Scrum update. So here's the first module. I've called it Overview for obvious reasons. Let's dive in and make a start. Again, I want to reinforce to you, Scrum has not changed at all, but the description of it has just got better. And by that, we mean some of the descriptions contained within the roles, events, and artifacts. So the following information updates should be used to enhance what you will already know about Scrum from our masterclass. So since being first published in 2010, the Scrum Guide has always been seen, quite rightly, as a living document. And this update is there to address any common misinterpretations or misunderstandings. So let me first introduce Scrum artifacts and commitments. You see, there are still just 3 artifacts in Scrum: the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and the increment, with each, as you will know, representing work or value. They are designed to maximize the transparency of key information. What has happened is that these artifacts have new corresponding commitments, which give you better clarity. So for the product backlog, it's something called the product goal. Now this is new, but fairly straightforward, as I shall explain it in the coming modules. For the sprint backlog, it's the sprint goal. And for the increment, it is the definition of done. Again, you'll be familiar with that last phrase. Making the point here is that we're merely tightening up some of the definitions, not changing the Scrum method in any way. So this diagram does nothing much more than simply summarize all the bits and parts that you've already covered and understood in our Scrum Masterclass. So I'm reinforcing the fact here that Scrum's simple rules remain untouched. So referring to the Scrum artifacts and these commitments. So starting with the sprint goal, still on the topic of Scrum artifacts and commitments. And these commitments exist to reinforce empiricism. It does so through the Scrum values for the Scrum team, their stakeholders, and to provide better focus on how to align teams to the goals and the steps needed to turn them into a reality. So the sprint goal then, this is the single sprint objective for the team to focus on the purpose of the sprint and answers the most important question in Scrum: why are we doing this? And frankly, the sprint should be cancelled if the sprint goal becomes obsolete, and only the product owner has the authority to cancel the sprint. So what exactly do all these things add up to? And what exactly are we trying to accomplish? Well, that's the sprint goal. You see, the sprint goal is the team's commitment to what will be delivered by the sprint backlog, which is an intimate description of that goal. Just a quick moment of reflection here. You'll recall you have the product backlog, which is a prioritized list of all of the features that need to be created during the project. And as part of sprint planning, the development team will, starting from the top of the product backlog, pull down from there those features which they believe can be converted into products or services during the upcoming sprint. And what they pull that into is called the sprint backlog. And as you can see, for a given sprint, what's in the sprint backlog is a direct reflection of exactly what they intend to achieve by the end of that sprint. So the sprint goal is there to help create coherence and focus, and encourages the Scrum team to work together rather than to scurry around on separate initiatives. And do remember that sprints are the heartbeat of Scrum, where ideas are turned into value. And remember that Scrum is founded on empiricism and lean thinking, whereas empiricism asserts that knowledge comes from experience and then going on to make decisions based on what is observed, whereas lean thinking reduces waste and focuses on the essentials. So before we leave the sprint goal, let me just summarise. The sprint goal, as I've said, is the single objective for the sprint, and its fundamental purpose is it provides a commitment by the developers, while at the same time providing some form of flexibility in terms of the exact work needed in order to achieve it. And the sprint goal itself is created during the sprint planning event and then added to the sprint backlog. And because of the flexibility of Scrum, while working on the sprint, if the work turns out to be different than expected, the developers collaborate with the product owner to negotiate the scope of the sprint backlog within the sprint without affecting the sprint goal. So sprints, therefore, are the heartbeat of Scrum, where ideas are turned into value. Next up, let's move on to the product goal. Now this is new to the Scrum Guide. You will not have come across this term within my Scrum Masterclass. However, don't worry, it's a step towards achieving the desired future state of the product, and it serves as a target for the Scrum team, I'll explain exactly who that is later, to plan against. Now the product goal describes a future state of the product, and it's contained within the product backlog, whereas the rest of the product backlog emerges to define what exactly will fulfill the product goal in terms of features, as I'm suggesting up here. And a quick reminder that a product, the things that you create from the Scrum sprints and various iterations, could be a service, it could be a physical product, or indeed something more abstract. And a product is a vehicle to deliver value, that's business value, with a clear boundary. In other words, it's scoped with known stakeholders and well-defined users or customers. So a Scrum team commits to deliver something of value, and a product goal helps ensure that each sprint is their commitment to getting closer to that. Let's move on to another phrase which you are familiar with, and that's the definition of done. Now that, as you can see, is a formal description of the state of the increment when and until it meets the quality measures required for the product. And the moment a product backlog item meets the definition of done, an increment is born. So part of the value of having a definition of done is that it gives the Scrum team a clear marker on when things are done and complete. And it also gives you one of the greatest deliverables in Scrum, the work not done. It tells Scrum teams where to stop. And this definition of done creates transparency by providing everyone with a shared understanding of what work was completed as part of the increment. And therefore, if a product backlog item, a feature if you will, or a user story, does not meet the definition of done, it cannot be released or even presented at the sprint review. Instead, it returns to the product backlog for possible future consideration. So the team commits to reaching that product increment at the end of each sprint, and it is their commitment to delivering quality and value in every product backlog item they create. So if something does not meet the definition of done, it cannot be released and should never be demonstrated at the sprint review. Hope that's clear. Very good. Well, there's a nice introduction to our Scrum update. Do join me in the next module, Module 2, where I shall be drilling down a little and looking at Scrum focus. So thanks for your time, thanks for your attention. Meanwhile, from me, Dave, it's bye for now.